Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. My guest today is Dr. Nilay Saiya. Nilay is an associate professor of public policy and global affairs at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He holds research interests in religion and global politics, international security, and American foreign policy. He's the author of two books, Weapon of Peace, How Religious Liberty Combats Terrorism. And his most recent book, the one we talk about on this episode, is his recent book, The Global Politics of Jesus, A Christian Case for Church-State Separation by Oxford University Press. It is an outstanding book. I just recently read it and said, man, it's just such a well-crafted, well-researched, well-written book. I was like, man, I would love to have Nilay on the podcast. Now, he lives on the other side of the world from where I'm in, so we had to arrange a time. So it's very early my time. It's pretty late his time. So I was very excited that Nilay agreed to make time for this conversation, which I know you are going to, well, you'll like most of it. Some of it's pretty challenging. We got off on a bunch of controversial topics, which is exciting and very theology in the raw-esque. So please welcome to the show for the first time, the one and only Nilay Saiya. Okay, hey friends, I am here with Dr. Nilay Saiya, all the way from Singapore. What time is it out there, Nilay? It's nighttime. You're on your end, I think, right?
We're probably close to, it's 9:40 right now.
Okay. Well, 7:40 my time. So, Are you a night person? Is this prime time for you, or are you ready to go to bed?
I'm usually in bed these days around 8:30. So I'm staying up, but it's not an issue. Not an issue at all.
Okay. Well, I peeled myself. I got in late last night from a trip, so that alarm, I decided to set my alarm at 7, which, I was like, all right. So, your book, okay, we're talking offline. I'll hold it up here for the YouTube audience. The Global Politics of Jesus, a Christian case for church-state separation. I came across this book on a whim. I think I was just looking at Amazon, looking for another book, and this one popped up, and the title intrigued me. I started courting the book, looking at who's endorsing it, who's publishing it. I'm like, oh, Oxford University Press. It's guaranteed to at least be a well-written, engaging book. And then I ordered it, sat at my desk for like a month because I was reading all this other stuff. I'm like, I need to see what this one's all about. And I could not put it down. It is such a, well, I was saying like it put language to so much of what I was feeling and thinking as a biblical guy, but you're coming at it from a political, but then, I mean, your stuff in the Bible is like so good. Like you hide your lack of theological higher education, very well. So, but you brought this whole kind of global political side that was just so helpful. Anyway, all that to say, thanks for coming on Theology in the Raw. Thanks
for having me, and I'm glad someone liked the book. It's always a positive thing.
Yeah, you may see a bump in sales after this episode because I think a lot of people that listen to this podcast will resonate with this book and probably what you're going to say in this podcast. So let's go back though. How were you raised? How did you get into wanting to be an academic, and then what led you to writing this book? Let's start there.
Yeah. So my parents were immigrants to the United States from India in the 1970s, and they settled in central Pennsylvania, of all places. Now, I'm not entirely sure why, but that's where they chose to settle, and not exactly the most diverse place in the world. We were probably the only brown people within a 20-mile radius. But, that's kind of the environment that I grew up in, and we attended a conservative evangelical church, very patriotic. And so, this was one of those churches that had a giant American flag, not only on the outside of the church, but right there in the sanctuary as well, next to a Christian flag. And, many more flags would begin to appear around national holidays like Memorial Day and the 4th of July. That was a big one. And so, this was kind of the environment that I was raised in. And the church prided itself on patriotism. So every 4th of July, the pastor would hold this patriotic service, and we would sing national hymns like "God Bless America" and the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and we would pledge allegiance to the flag, and we would do it all. And eventually, I just came to question all of it. I'm like, what does any of this have to do with the gospel? What are we doing here? And at a very young age, I came to see that this was really a form of idolatry. And, what really hit me was the 2016 presidential election.
Hmm.
I think that really is what made me want to write this book,
Okay.
because that in that election, 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump.
Mm.
Perhaps the most immoral person to have run for the presidency in recent history. And not only did they vote for Trump, but they were also making Christian arguments for why they voted for Trump, right? And it almost seemed like all their Christian convictions went out the window when it came to this particular individual. So, in the span of about 10 years, white evangelicals went from being the group that said that morality mattered the most in politics to being the group that said it mattered the least.
Mm.
Right. And even after the whole Access Hollywood tape came out and everything, they just stuck by him. And I just couldn't make
Mm.
sense of it. And so I think that's really where this whole idea for the book came from. Just questioning our assumptions about politics and, how church and state should relate to one another. And, I also had an experience here in Singapore. When I landed in Singapore for the first time in 2018, the taxi we rode from the airport had a large cross hanging from the rearview mirror. So I was a little bit surprised to see this. And then we got into a conversation with the taxi driver, and he asked where we were from, and we told him we were from the United States. And at that point, he got very excited, and he said, "Oh, Trump, he's a good man. He's a Christian." And I'm like, okay, Singapore couldn't be further away from the United States.
Yeah.
It's literally on the other side of the globe. And even here, I can't get away from Trumpism. And so, this taxi driver went on to explain how he believed that the election of Donald Trump would lead to a great revival throughout the United
Mm.
States. And he expressed hope that the same thing could happen in Singapore.
Wow.
And of course, Christian nationalism isn't as big a thing here as it is in the United States. Singapore isn't a Christian country or anything like that. But even in some of these churches, you'll see some elements of that. So it's not just something that is confined to the United States, but
Mhm.
you can find it all over the world.
That was one of the more eye-opening things in your book is you have I think a whole chapter documenting all of the places where in other countries where you have maybe a Christian, let's say a leader that claims to be a Christian, or when Christians
Mhm.
have power. It just maybe I don't want to say always, but maybe that's true. It just has not gone well for so many countries. I thought that was helpful because I mean, like, yeah, with you, look at like Christian nationalism in America. For those of us, I guess, who might be underimpressed with that way of thinking, or think it's idolatry, it can almost become low hanging fruit because, yeah, it's just so in your face, right? In some churches, like the one you grew up in, it can
Mhm.
be easy to think this is just an American problem, but yeah, it's not just an American problem. Can you give us some? Well, we're getting diving. Let's go back to your story, and then I'm sure we'll come back to that. So, so that's what led you to write the book. What have you done a lot of work in political theology in your own thinking, or did this book was your thinking kind of crystallized in this book, or was this something that you've already had kind of in your mind for a long, long time?
Yeah, I think it's something that I had in my mind for a long time.
Mhm.
But I should mention that I'm not a theologian by training. I am a political scientist
Mhm.
who is attempting to bring theology into the argument of this book. So essentially, what I'm doing is I'm marrying certain theology that I'm advocating for with the methods of social science. And
Okay.
so this is something that hasn't been done. And, it's interesting because when I told some very prominent sociologists about what I was doing, they kind of warned me against not doing it because they didn't think it was a very good combination, bringing
Uh,
theology and social science together. But then they actually read the book and they liked it a lot. And so they admitted that they were wrong and that this actually does work pretty well.
yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, your first two chapters, you lay such a strong theological backbone. I mean, even if it's not like a work in like, the highest level critical whatever, but you
Hmm.
clearly have read a ton. It's as far as I've read the same stuff. I'm like, oh yeah, he's accurately reflecting this, wrestling with it, and providing a very good, I think, summary of. I mean, just the radicality of the kingdom of God as a
Hmm.
political concept in the New Testament, which the people who are professional theologians, whatever that means, like Yeah, you're not saying anything that hasn't already been said. You were summarizing and applying it to
Hmm.
a more political area, your main area of expertise, which I thought was fascinating. Um, well, you have a chapter where you summarize kind of three broadly speaking, three different approaches to kind of church and state. If I can
Hmm.
remember, Christianism,
Right.
detachment, and prophetic witness. And even
Hmm.
right there, prophetic witness just sounds better. So people could probably guess that that third one is
Right.
going to be the one
That's the good one. Yeah.
you're going to advocate for. But can you walk us through those three approaches and maybe offer some? Here's why I think these first two approaches maybe fall short of the Christian vision.
Yeah, yeah, sure. So what I'm attempting to do in this book is to think about how Christians should relate to political authority. And what I'm doing is I'm taking on the conventional wisdom. And the conventional wisdom is a school of thought that is known as transformationalism. And the basic idea here is that because God is the sovereign over the entire universe, Christians have a responsibility to manifest that lordship in every area of life, including politics. Right? So this kind of calls on Christians to transform and redeem and ultimately control their political orders for the glory of Christ. And again, this is kind of how Christians tend to think about the relationship between church and state, religion and politics. And so transformationalists believe that Christians should seek positions within the government and try and steer politics in a
Mhm,
more virtuous Christian direction.
mhm,
Now, as I see it, there are some problems with this worldview, and I lay them out in the first chapter of the book. One is that the passages in the New Testament that address the issue of civil government always separate
mhm,
the spiritual from the profane, right? So we can even think about the teachings of Christ here, right? So on one occasion, when Jesus is standing before Pontius Pilate, and he's asked if by Pilate if he's a king. Jesus responds, "My kingdom is not of this world," right?
mhm,
It couldn't be any clearer than that. Jesus didn't see his mission in temporal terms the way that we tend to think about politics today. His kingdom is something different altogether.
mhm,
And there's another instance where he was being questioned about the issue of taxation.
mhm,
And he's asked, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? And so he asks for a coin to be brought to him, and he holds up the coin and he asks, whose portrait is this and whose inscription? And the crowd answers Caesar's. And then Jesus responds, well, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and to God what belongs to God.
mhm,
And so again, we see this kind of separation
mhm,
between the spiritual and the profane.
mhm,
And it's interesting because in this particular passage, what belongs to God? If the coin belongs to Caesar, what belongs to God is your very self. Give yourselves to God. That's what Jesus is saying in this verse.
mhm,
And then the third problem, I think, is that transformationalism, or as I call it in the book Christianism, it
mhm,
has a distorted understanding of salvation and redemption. So as we read about it in the New Testament, salvation is something that happens to people. Redemption is something that happens to people, right? But when the scripture talks about entities, it likens them to a drop in the bucket or to dust on the scales. So it's people who are the recipients of God's grace, not institutions or nation states or anything like that.
mhm,
So now, when transformationalism becomes wedded to a quest for political power and the
mhm,
marginalization of non-Christians, it becomes something I call Christianism,
mhm.
right? So that's really what I'm critiquing here, but it stems from this whole transformationalist idea.
Yeah, yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
I would say that's in my, at least in the circles I run, it's some form of that. Even ones that want to maintain a strong separation of church and state. Like they're not necessarily fighting to put prayer back in schools, or whatever. Like,
Hmm.
there still is this idea, like the Kuyper quote you have in the book. Every square inch of this creation is mine, and so Christians
Hmm.
need to be redeeming every square inch. And it's, I mean, and I don't. Part of me is like, yeah, there is definitely some truth to that. I just think that there's also, and you point this out, and Hauerwas and Yoder and others do too, that there's there's this other theme though, that these other kingdoms on the earth are empowered by, but in Revelation terms, they're empowered by the dragon. Like there's they're not just neutral entities. There's something almost competing with the kingdom of God, and not that. And here's where you fall. It's not revolution. The kingdom of God is the same kind of political entity where it's going to overthrow this kingdom, but they're not. They're not just. They're not just walking hand in hand as friends. Like, oh, you're doing the secular stuff, we'll do the spiritual stuff, and we're kind of have this happy-go-lucky relationship, separate. But it's like, well, no, there's also something kind of like we should be nervous, not eager, but more nervous, getting entangled in those powers, those principalities and powers, and so on. So,
yeah. I mean, as I read it, it's an antagonistic relationship between church and state, really. And that's something I'm trying to draw out in the book. As we read the scriptures, we see that really functional dominion over the world belongs to Satan, right? I'm thinking about the second temptation of Christ, when Satan takes Jesus up to a very high mountain, shows him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And Satan says to him, all this I will give to you if you bow down and worship me. And Jesus responds, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. So, I mean, essentially, this was a Christian nationalist temptation, right? And what's interesting about this is that Jesus never disputed Satan's claim to have dominion over the entire world. And if this is really a temptation, then Satan would have had to have that. Otherwise, what kind of temptation is it if he doesn't have that kind of power to begin with? And then we read later on, John the Evangelist says that the entire world is under the control of the evil one. So we kind of see this language over and over again.
Yeah. And or even you go all the way back to Daniel, right? You have, when you peek behind the spiritual curtain, and I think it's Daniel 11 or Daniel 10, you see, is it an angel is like going to fight the prince of Persia, and then the prince of Greece is going to come on. It's like, well, there's these spiritual authorities that are sort of enmeshed with these other empires. And then you have these angelic beings like behind the scenes going and doing battle against them. It's like, yeah, this is not, your phrase, there's kind of an antagonistic relationship that doesn't lead to revolution, shouldn't, but is not designed to be two flags on Sunday morning, one American, one of the empire. Why? So okay, so I just opened up a can of worms there, calling America the empire. How should we? Can we? How do we correlate this antagonistic relationship to the empires in the Bible times to, and let's just say if the the United States of America, I guess number two might be China or some of these superpower government entities, because I mean, is Switzerland an empire? Are they Babylon too? Or the Tahiti, or I should we distinguish between kinds of modern government entities where some would be more empires or empire-like and others not? Or how? Yeah. And this is actually a really genuine question I have. Like, how do we map these? Do we? And if we do, how do we map these themes on our current situation?
I think they're all kingdoms of the world, right? And kingdoms of the world come in better or worse forms. Like, for example, many people would disagree with me, but I think that Singapore is a superior kingdom of the world than the United States. That's why I live here, right? Again, lots of Americans would disagree with that. And I happen to be an American. But, I would rather live in the United States than, say, China. And I would rather live in China than North Korea. So, I'm not arguing that they're all functionally equivalent. Clearly, there are some that are better than others to live in, especially if you're a Christian. But when we use that term empire, I don't think it necessarily applies to every country in the world. They're all kingdoms of the world. They all have their benefits and their drawbacks. Some are better than others. But empire is, that term is used to describe really big, powerful political entities. So in the modern world, there are three countries that would qualify as potentially being an empire of some sort. So you have the United States, China, and Russia. So in the study of international relations, we know these countries as great powers. right? But others might refer to them as empires or potential empires. The Soviet Union during the Cold War, it was its own empire. So I think that's what we have in mind, the really big, powerful countries when we're
Yeah.
discussing empires.
Do you have off the top of your head? Because I yeah, I have one written down somewhere where I actually went and looked at how a lot of people define empire. I don't have a definition off the top of my head, but it has to do with something with some kind of global, like beyond your own nation, not just like you're going and taking over countries, but something where your decisions like radically affect other countries, or they may even be willing to want to come under your kind of like power, maybe for protection or whatever. So even I think the example was even having, I don't know how many hundreds of military bases around the
Hmm.
globe that the United States,
Hmm.
like that is a very imperial kind of thing to do. Would that, so I'm yeah. Is America is it an empire like? What are the qualities that constitute an empire in your
Hmm.
opinion?
Yeah, an empire is a country that has massive global influence. And clearly, the United States would fall into that category. There hasn't
Okay.
been a country on this level in world history, really. Even the British Empire, I don't
Oh
think
wow.
was
Okay.
as powerful as the United States. But at the same time, the American empire is declining, and it will eventually be superseded by China. Now, when that point in time comes, I'm not sure, but this is kind of the history of the world. You see the rise and fall of empires.
That's a bold statement. Can you go there? Keep going there? Because this is your area. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
political science. So China will supersede America at some point.
I think most scholars of international relations believe that the transition is actually happening now,
Okay.
right? China has a much larger population than the United States. The United States keeps getting itself bogged down in these pointless wars. And so that's all facilitating this giant transition of power from west to east. And so eventually China will overtake the United
Mm,
States. And then when that happens, the big question is, how is the US going to respond to that circumstance?
interesting.
Hmm.
Let's, because I know I'm sure somebody somewhere is disagreeing with you right now, which is fine.
Hmm.
Uh, my where my heart goes is like for Christians living in the U.S. that just heard you say that, is that like disappointing if it's true? And if it is, then I wonder how, like, I don't know, like, I mean, will that affect the kingdom of God? Will that possibly even make the kingdom of God maybe flourish more? Because historically, when the kingdom of God, when churches find themselves in a position of political weakness rather than power,
Hmm.
we tend to be more effective just historically. I mean, you look at like the pre-Constantine church versus the post-Constantine church, and I'm not a historian, so I'm dabbling here, but I mean, it seems like there was a not that everything was bad during that transition, but there was kind of the Christian faith got a bit diluted, got a little syncretistic. You had people in positions of religious powers or in religious powers, pastors and priests and everything that were just not loving their enemies and doing the thing that the church was very zealous to do before Constantine. So part of me is like, and this, okay, so let's just say China does overtake America as a
Hmm.
superpower.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I would ask Christians, so what? So
Yeah,
what?
I mean,
I mean, is that
our hope.
yeah?
I mean, our hope is not in horses or chariots. So, we trust in God as Christians. But I've actually looked into this question, right? And there's three types of environments that Christians have found themselves in historically. One is a context of pluralism, where Christianity exists alongside other religions, and kind of has to compete with these other religions for adherence. There is a context of persecution, where Christians are persecuted by the state. So, pre-Constantine, for
Mhm.
example. And then there is a context of state support for Christianity.
Okay.
And what my research finds is that Christians fare best in contexts of pluralism,
Okay.
where they have to compete with other religions for adherence. And now, why is that? Why would Christians fare better in conditions of pluralism? Because in these conditions, they are not receiving special support from the state.
Hmm.
So Christians in these contexts, they have to make persuasive arguments against the arguments being made by other religions. And in context of state support for Christianity, Christians in the church, they're reliant on the state. So they become distracted from their missions of evangelizing and looking after the poor, marginalized, and so forth. Now, in terms of persecution, it's a mixed bag. In some cases, Christianity has grown in context of persecution. Um, the Roman Empire, for example, China in the 20th century, Christianity saw explosive growth despite there being massive persecution against Christians, especially during the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. But there are other cases of persecution that have been dreadful for Christians. I have in mind 7th century North Africa, 17th century Japan. The Christian community in Japan, even today, hasn't recovered from that persecution. But of those three arrangements, persecution, pluralism, and power, clearly the best for Christianity is pluralism.
So to answer my question that might have sounded obnoxious, so what? Well, because America would fit the pluralistic framework, right? And if we end up losing that and becoming subsumed under somebody else's power, we might move toward a more persecuted church, possibly. So somebody could say, well, that would be the so what? Like, okay, we shouldn't be pro-America, we shouldn't be whatever, but the ingredients are here for Christianity to thrive in America versus if another superpower like took us over or something like that. Not us, but took over America.
I wouldn't worry about that. No country's going to overtake the United States anytime soon anyways. So what I'm more concerned about in the United States is what Christians themselves are doing. And we see this movement to try and Christianize the country, right? So Christian nationalism has become a major thing in the United States. And Christian nationalism, as I define it, is an ism. It is a political program or ideology that seeks to privilege a certain rendering of Christianity in the public square over other religious traditions. And so what Christian nationalists want is a relationship of privilege with the state. And so my research shows that will not be good for Christianity. That's going to lead to declines in the overall Christian population.
And would you say that is what happened with the quote unquote salvation of Constantine and the Constantinian kind of revolution? Was that when Christianity went from a position of weakness to political power?
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that happened overnight, right?
Right.
But it did happen over time. So I can give you one example, right? So before Constantine, Christianity was a pacifist religion, right? Every early Christian thinker who addressed the question of war and peace before Constantine did so from a pacifist perspective. And that all changed after the political empowerment of Christianity. Again, not overnight, but eventually you start seeing Christian thinkers make Christian arguments for participation in warfare. So, we see this with Augustine of Hippo, for example. He believed that coercion, including violence, could be used to protect Christians from heresies. And so we can trace the doctrine of just war to thinkers like Augustine and then later Aquinas. But eventually, Christians began marshaling arguments, not just for just war, but for holy war. Trying to conquer lands in the name of Christ and convert people to Christianity. And so, it wasn't too long before we have Christian participation in the Crusades and colonization. And I think Christianity suffered greatly as a result.
You've mentioned Christian nationalism a few times. So you left in 2018 from America, which actually might give you a unique perspective. Sometimes an outside perspective, having been on the inside, is really helpful. In your viewpoint, do you think this Christian nationalism is getting stronger and more vibrant and more populist in America, or is it declining, or do we have data on that? Or
There are some sociologists in the United States who collect data on Christian nationalism. So I have in mind people like Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry. They've done some excellent
Oh
work on
yeah.
Christian nationalism in the United States. I think they show that Christian nationalism is actually declining in numbers. So there are
Okay.
fewer Christian nationalists now than there were, say, back in 2016. But at the same time, the Christian nationalists who remain are becoming increasingly vocal
Okay.
and increasingly violent. So it's still very much something that we have to be guarding against.
Hmm.
And we also know that Christian nationalism is growing outside of the United States as well, in places like Brazil,
Hmm.
Central African Republic, Uganda. We see a different form of Christian nationalism, what I call Christian civilizationalism in Europe. Of course, we know what's happening with Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church and the invasion of
Yeah.
Ukraine. So yeah, it's something that's not just an American phenomenon, but it's growing around the world.
That was you jogged my memory. Yeah, when you summarized how the Russian church and I think even Putin, how Putin kind of tapped into his religious base and had this kind of somewhat of a marriage between the state and the Russian Orthodox Church, which already had, kind of a long history there. It
Mhm.
almost sounded like you're describing kind of like the 1980s in America and this marriage between the Republican Party and the moral majority and I know people who are maybe supportive of that in America, like, yeah, but we're doing it well. We're the good guys. Russian Orthodox Church aren't even Christians anyway, and Putin's a tyrant. And it's like, well, okay, there might be some truth to some of that, but it's more the fundamental idea of, is it healthy for the church to kind of get too chummy with one side of the political aisle anywhere, really? Like, has that ever gone well for the gospel? And you answer pretty clearly no.
Just seems to
um,
me like as I read world history, whenever the church has become entangled with political power, both the church and the state have suffered, and
yeah.
Christianity has often become complicit in terrible abuses of human rights and abuses of power. Right. So I have in mind Christian support for the dictatorship of Rios Montt in Guatemala, Pentecostal dictator,
Mhm.
who ended up killing tens of thousands of his own people.
Wow.
The Catholic Church's support for the Dirty War in Argentina, Christian complicity in the Rwandan genocide, the support of the Dutch Reformed Church for the racist system of apartheid in South Africa.
Mhm.
And of course, the Russian Orthodox Church's support for the invasion of Ukraine, that'd be a contemporary example. So,
Mhm.
yeah, it
Wow.
just it always leads to the denigration of Christian witness.
Wow. All
Hmm.
right, so that's Christianism. We were still on point one. So
Yeah.
detachment. We could probably guess what that's about, but yeah, what's a detachment kind of mindset? What does that look like?
So I kind of think of detachment as the opposite of Christianism or transformationalism. Detachment refers to the idea that Christians should be separated from the world,
Hmm.
that Christianity really doesn't speak to matters of justice or politics or anything like that. So Christians, with that in mind, should take a step back from the world and kind of isolate themselves from what's going on, focus on preaching the gospel and evangelism. So in this viewpoint, the world is seen as a sinking ship. And the job of the church is to save as many people from the doom ship as possible before the end of the world.
Hmm.
And so this kind of jives well with the whole idea of religion being an opiate of the masses. Um, and so, detached theology is not the pervasive theology in the church today. I think much more prevalent is the theology of transformationalism and Christianism.
Hmm.
But it's still there in certain fundamentalist communities.
Yeah.
You can see it in certain Amish and conservative Mennonite communities as well. Um, you might be familiar with Rod Dreher's book, The Benedict Option.
Yeah.
I kind of see that in line with this whole idea of detachment. But again, it's not the greatest threat to the church in my view. And in fact, there's actually something to like about detachment theology because it calls on the church to retain its purity and holiness in the midst of an unholy world. Yeah.
That's what I appreciated about your analysis of each of these views is you do, first of all,
Mhm.
you do it very so like fair, and like you're not like railing on any of them. I mean, you even say like here's some good things in each one of these that we can appreciate, but here's
Mhm.
why maybe overall this is not the best approach. The detachment
Right.
was interesting to me because when you're talking about in my mind, when you're talking about people that are just, saving souls from a sinking ship, um, like I know a lot of Christians that are, or not so much anymore, but like I grew up in kind of an environment that was like that. But then it also had a kind of like very exclusively kind of right wing political commitment, not from a reform transformational sense, not in a Kuiper, it was
Mhm.
more, it was kind of almost schizophrenic a little bit. It was like, it's like when it was a Democrat in office, we're like, oh, we're exiles, we're being oppressed. And the answer is
Mhm.
not, to live like an exile in Babylon, no matter who's in office. The answer is like, we need to get a Christian into office, or we need to get the right person in office. So
Mhm.
but it still had kind of a detachment theology of like salvation, the individual, the kingdom's not, when my kingdom is not of this world, is like, yeah, Jesus reigns in our individual hearts, and
Mhm.
he didn't get
Mhm.
involved in politics. I'm like,
Mhm.
I that's not quite what he was saying either. Is
Right.
that right to kind of say there might be a blend? People kind of, depending on the time of the day, have a detachment idea, but then kind of have more of a, and it always is kind of a right wing kind of political interest, or
I that can definitely happen, and it's important to note that these 3 categories are not necessarily discrete.
okay,
There can be some overlap, between them. Just to give you an example, so, as I mentioned, I grew up in central Pennsylvania, and there was a point in time when, the Mennonite communities in central Pennsylvania, they would almost always just stay out of politics altogether.
no,
But around 2016, I began to see, Mennonite farmers. They were starting to put up pro-Trump signs. I would go to some Mennonite stores, and they would have, political pamphlets there.
oh wow,
That would have never happened, maybe 10, 15 years before, but things started to change as things were changing throughout the whole country,
mhm.
even within those communities.
Okay, interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, 2016 did rattle everybody's cage on so many levels, I think.
It certainly did, yes.
This episode is sponsored by Biola University. Biola is consistently ranked as one of the nation's leading Christian universities. Biola has over 300 academic programs at both the undergraduate and graduate levels, which are available both in Southern California and online. With leading academic programs like business, film, science, and more, Biola's biblically integrated curriculum helps students grow closer to God and gain a deeper understanding of Scripture. In fact, I was just at the Biola campus a few weeks ago. I toured the campus and talked with several deans and professors, and every single one I talked to was so passionate about making Christ first in all things. I mean, Biola's quality of academics is well documented. There's no doubt about that. But I was most impressed with how utterly Christ-centered the school is. So at Biola, students become equipped for a thriving life and career. They'll learn how to articulate their Christian beliefs, and most of all, they'll be prepared to serve as God's instrument in their community and around the world. Now, through June 1st, 2023, you can use the promo code Preston to waive the application fee for any Biola program. Okay, the deadline used to be May 1st. They actually extended it for our audience to June 1st. So get your application in before June 1st. Put in the code Preston and get your application fee waived. Some restrictions may apply. Just visit www.biola.edu for more information. The one danger I've seen I know we've been a little bit right wing heavy here, and I think that's a bit, it's a low hanging fruit. It's just, there's so much
Mhm. Mhm.
in your face to kind of like not be excited about. The one danger I've seen, I think there has been an uptick after 2016, is kind of this critique of right wing Christianity from the perspective of left wing Christian, or the answer to Trump is Hillary or Biden. And it's like,
Mhm.
whoa, 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 whoa,
Mhm.
whoa, hold on, like
Yep.
that's not what we're trying to say here. That's just the same version of the different side of the same coin. And I think, of course, in the Christianity in America, numerically, the biggest problem would be, an idolatry of right wing politics, or however you want to frame it. But I have seen, at least in circles I run, which is fairly broad, it's like,
Mhm.
the I think you're getting too political on the other side now, and I see danger in that. If Trump is the Messiah, that's problematic. But if he's also the Antichrist, Jesus is the Messiah, not Hillary or Biden or whoever. It's like, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or because I appreciated your book very much. Seem to take that line as well.
I think there are absolutely forms of Christian nationalism on the left. They just look different than they do on the right, and they're perhaps less discernible. But we can think back to Joe Biden's 2020 presidential campaign slogan, and he ran on this platform of restoring the soul of America, as if countries could have souls, right? And this is, it's a form of progressive Christian nationalism. It looks different, but it's still there. I remember back in 2019, AOC tweeted something about her support for a law that would prohibit usury, and her justification for her support of that law was that usury happens to be banned in the Bible.
Oh, wow.
And so we need to ban it in the country as well. So if you look closely enough, you can see it across the spectrum, but it tends to be more pervasive on the right, I think.
I mean, I don't want to get too cynical, but maybe just a little bit. Like, a lot of this is kind of a game. Like any, at least in America, I would say it's probably true outside. Like, a politician's gonna use religious language and appeal to a religious base when it solidifies their base or gains more power and keeps them in office. Like, they will quote the Bible in certain contexts when, if they're anyway, I don't want to keep going on that, but I just see it. It's like, can't we see what's going on here? Like,
oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And you have quotes of, even when left-wing politicians in certain contexts, maybe it's a Catholic context, or maybe in an African-American churches that might vote more Democrat, you'll use religious language to solidify that base. I mean, yeah. Okay. Prophetic witness. How is this viewpoint, this approach, distinguished between the first two, and why do you find this the most compelling representation of Scripture?
Yeah. So I think that this choice between Christianism or transformationalism and detachment theology is really a false choice. Like, it's not a choice between utopianism and pessimism. There's a third way that Christians can approach public life, and I call this third way prophetic witness. So in the Bible, the prophets were countercultural radicals, and they lambasted the values of their surrounding culture, and they were depicted as thorns in the flesh of those in power. And so I kind of see this as being the way that Christians need to think about how they live in the kingdom of the world. And they kind of take on the role of being a prophet. And so what does prophetic witness look like in practice? I think we have some clues in the book of James. The first chapter, verse 27, James says, "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world." So there are two different aspects of prophetic witness that we find in this verse. The first is a justice aspect, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, but we can expand that to include all marginalized and oppressed groups, the groups that Jesus would stand in solidarity with. And the other aspect is to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. And this is equally important. So I remember, when I was an undergraduate in college, I would tell people that I was majoring in political science because I was just really interested in politics. And they would tell me, "Oh, you need to go to Washington because we need godly people in Washington who can set the country on the right course." And I thought about it, and I quickly realized, Washington is where godliness goes to die. Like, how many godly politicians can you think of that serve in the House of Representatives or the Senate, and actually, are outspoken about their faith, and they act like Christians are supposed to act like. Very few, right? And that's because there's a leveling effect that happens in the kingdom of the world. Christians end up succumbing to the rules of the kingdom of the world. When in fact they're supposed to be forming an alternative political community with only Jesus as being the king. So that's the whole idea behind prophetic witness.
Can you unpack that last phrase? Because I think that's something. You touch in your book. Hauerwas is famous for doing it. That the church is to be an alternative polis. The Greek word for a city or a society, almost like we are to embody the political themes, economics, race relations, how we treat the outsider, what do we do with our enemies, what do we do with people in financial need, what does social class look like? Like the church is to embody the very political vision that we sometimes want our country to do, but sometimes we skip over embodying it as a church and we just focus so much on the country doing these things. Can you unpack that a bit? Because I think that's really, really crucial.
Yeah, so the New Testament word that the authors use for the church is ecclesia. And that is a term that has all kinds of political connotations to it. And so the idea is that Christians do not have dual loyalties. They have only one loyalty, and that loyalty is to Jesus. Now, transformationalists will argue, no, Christians have dual loyalties. They have one loyalty to Christ, an ultimate loyalty, and they have a secondary loyalty to their countries. But I don't think this is what we mean when we use the word ecclesia. Christians have one loyalty to Christ alone. He is king. And really, there are no other loyalties. And the reason I say that is because it will frequently, if not almost always, be the case that the kingdom of the world will be in tension with the kingdom of the cross. And the reason why is because they operate according to entirely different rules, such that success in the kingdom of the world would mean failure in the kingdom of the cross and vice versa. Right? So the way I think about it is like trying to advance the kingdom of God through politics is like trying to play the game of basketball using the rules of the game of football, right? It doesn't make any sense. And if you do that, you might get lucky from time to time, but generally it's going to be a train wreck. And so, another way of thinking about it, let's take a hypothetical example. Let's say you have a hitman, and this hitman decides, you know what, I've had a change of heart. I'm going to convert to Christianity. I'm going to become a Christian. But then he says, I'm going to be a Christian hitman. That would be completely absurd, right? And Christians would call out that individual, and rightfully so. You can't be a Christian hitman. So how much more sense does it make for Christians to participate in the kingdoms of the world and yet behave, like they're Christians when they have to follow a completely different set of rules while in the kingdom of the world? It becomes impossible, really.
So are you saying Christians should not be occupying positions in any kind of government? Is that, yeah.
I don't know that I would say that Christians can't interact with the state or Christians can never hold any positions within the state. I do think, though, that there are certain positions that are completely off limits for Christians.
Okay.
To give you one example, I think that military service is completely off limits for Christians. I don't see how you can reconcile serving in the military with Christ's teachings in the Sermon on the Mount.
As a combatant, or what if it's like a chaplain or a medic or something like that? Or...
Yeah, so that becomes a little bit more open to debate, and even among Christian pacifists,
Sure.
You will find that debate. I think there it might be a matter of conviction, but certainly not as combatants, right?
Okay.
How do you reconcile killing someone on the battlefield with Christ's command to turn the other cheek and to love not only your neighbor but also your enemy, and to do good to those who hate you, to bless those who curse you, to pray for those who mistreat you? I don't know any way that you can reconcile that tension and still retain your Christian convictions. Now, again, this is not the dominant perspective among Christians anywhere in the world today. And so I expect that will always be a minority position.
Yeah. Globally, it's I was more popular, would you say, or not necessarily than like Christian? I know in America, it's definitely a minority view, but outside of America, I'm just trying to think different places I've been. Yeah, I don't know, maybe not.
I
Oh,
don't. I
certainly
don't.
when I was living in the United Kingdom,
Mhm.
it was, and I don't know, people would be walking around calling themselves like pacifists, or whatever, but they would see the church in America as just way too gun happy and militaristic. And I remember I did a speaking tour in the UK, and my overarching theme was like controversial topics. So I talked about hell,
Mhm.
sexuality, and then nonviolence. And I remember everywhere I went, they're like, when I brought up the nonviolence, they're like, I thought we were talking about controversial stuff. Like they're probably like, well, yeah,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, yeah.
But if I do that in America, it's like I blow up a room if I even talk, talk about nonviolence.
I think it depends on the kind of country
Okay.
that you live in, right? So if you live in a country that's considered a great power that
Okay.
fights lots of wars, then you're much less likely to be a pacifist,
Okay.
right? So think of, the United States or Russia today.
Mhm.
The Christians in those countries tend to be much more supportive of violent means to solve disputes. It wouldn't necessarily be that way in countries that are not constantly fighting wars.
Mhm. Okay.
So maybe that might explain
Yeah.
why you had the experience you did in Europe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
So how about a governor? Should do you think again? And I know you're giving you're taking your political theology and trying to make practical application, which is always going to be like,
Mhm.
we I don't know if we should be the 100% confident on some of these things, but like in your
Mhm.
thought, like how high up in the political rung do you start getting really nervous? So it's like, okay, you run for like a city council or something, like some
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
local political thing that's just might feel different. But then what about like Congress, Senate, governor, or something like that? Or is that a right way for me to even ask it? Like there's kind of the deeper you go into the belly of Babylon, the maybe the more nervous we should be about that.
I think the key question that Christians have to ask themselves is, can they participate in any occupation,
Hmm.
whether it's in the government or in business or anything else, and still retain their Christian convictions, right? And if the answer is no, then it's probably not a position that
Okay.
a Christian should find himself or herself in.
Okay.
But I don't make recommendations for each level of government or
Right.
anything
Right.
like that.
Well, and Christian convictions too. Here's where I want to open up. Well, and we don't have time to open up fully right now, but I mean, like people say, yeah, see, we should be, anti-abortion and pro-military and pro-Second Amendment. And these are our Christian
Mhm.
convictions. So of course a politician can easily do that. I'm like, no, I'm talking like let's widen our lens a little bit on what Christian convictions should look like. Sure, it may include, standing up for the unborn. It also, I don't know. Sometimes our quote unquote Christian convictions held by Christians in governmental positions. I'm like, are those actually Christian convictions? Like, is there, standing up for the Second Amendment? Is that?
Mhm.
I'm not even saying I disagree with it on like maybe a political of whatever, but it's like, is that a
Mhm.
Christian conviction? So, um, yeah, which is
I,
hard. I
I
don't know. It's a whole different framework though, and
I mean, it's interesting because on some of these questions, you will find Christians of good faith on different sides,
sure,
right? So let's take the issue of abortion, for example.
a
Most
nice easy.
Christians,
No, yeah,
yeah, I know. Most Christians, both on the right and the left, would agree that abortion is an evil,
hmm,
and we should do whatever we can as a society to, at the least, reduce the number of abortions that are taking place.
hmm,
But Christians on the right, they have one way of going about it, and Christians on the left a completely different way, right? So the standard way that conservative Christians have tackled the issue of abortion is through politics. So
right,
you vote for the right political candidate to become president, and that president will appoint conservative Supreme Court justices, and those Supreme Court justices will then vote to overturn Roe Wade. And of course, this is
mhm,
exactly what happened with the Trump administration, right? So Trump appointed conservative Supreme Court justices who eventually did overturn Roe
mhm,
Wade. But Christians on the left would have a very different way of going about it. They might agree with the goal that, abortion should be reduced, but they would pursue policies like poverty alleviation,
Mm-hmm.
right? Expanded access to healthcare, even sex education in public schools. And all of these methods have been proven to work. So, from 1990 to today, we've seen a dramatic reduction in the number of abortions that have been taking place. And it's largely because of these progressive policies, not because of the conservative activism.
Interesting.
So, it's just it's fascinating, right? Because these other policies seem to have worked to reduce the number of abortions.
One thing from a Christian perspective, that often don't see touched on. I remember reading the stat somewhere, and so don't quote me on this, but it was something like, I'm going to say 20 to 30% of people that get abortions are in a religious conservative environment, to where having a baby outside of marriage is way more shameful than secretly going and getting an abortion, and not having to deal with all the religious shame. And it's like, well, wait a minute, are we addressing that problem, to where if somebody made a mistake, had sex outside of marriage, that we come around them with grace and community and care for the child? And if they would rather go get an abortion than face this kind of Christian culture, like, I'm like, well, we got a lot of work to do there. Just changing a law, that might be one of the things that could lead to, but as you're saying, there's a complex web of why people are getting, why somebody would go get an abortion, that also needs to be addressed. I'm not an expert on abortion. That was one thing that always stuck in my mind when I read that stat. I'm like, man, that's. Can you verify that? Have you come across that at all? Or
yeah, I'm not an expert in abortion either, so I haven't come across that stat. But I wouldn't find it surprising. I think it's so stigmatizing, and it just tells you where the church really is today. That that women who find themselves in that position would opt for an abortion rather than to have a child.
Yeah. I remember meeting somebody who, like, we had a discussion about abortion, like in a small group, and she came out and said, man, this is back when I was in California years ago. And she was kind of in tears after. She's like, yeah, when I was a teenager, I got an abortion. I haven't told hardly anybody, and she told the story of why she did it, what was going through her heart or angst. She was, she wasn't raped, but it was kind of just an unhealthy relationship, and the guy ended up taking off. Like, this is a bad situation. Like, she was a victim. Okay. Like, she was not, I want to go kill my baby. It wasn't, she was scared to death, scared that her parents would find out. All this. I'm like, oh my gosh, like, that at least puts flesh on what is a very complex situation that does include the evil of killing an unborn child. I did not plan on wandering into the abortion. I might get some emails about this one. But, but I guess, okay, so here's my point. This is actually is a good example of when Christians think that their primary moral call with political stuff is to work through the channels of, I'll say, Babylon, to kind of, implement Christian values in society. If that's kind of their focus, I think there's a lot of other actual kingdom work that they miss out on when they think, if we can just get the right person in office, do this, to get this law passed, and then righteousness has been done. Well, I think did we glitch out a little bit there?
Yeah, I kind of lost you the last 30 seconds there.
Okay, well, that's all right. I was just saying, we can move on from the abortion thing. So let's before I let you go, so prophetic witness, can you give us maybe an airtight summary of? Well, actually, I do need you to address the pushback that this perspective often gets. That, like, well, wait a minute, if we need to seek the good of the city. We need to, the state is orchestrated for our good and to punish evil and reward good doing. You had these more positive statements about these empires or government entities. And so some people use those passages, Jeremiah 29, Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, examples of soldiers getting saved or whatever in the Gospels, of like, no, this has more of a we can have this dual allegiance. How do you respond to the critique that prophetic witness is removing your Christian influence from society and letting evil run more rampant, I guess, is sometimes how it's framed.
I don't think that I see it quite that way. I don't believe that prophetic witness requires Christians to remove their influence from society. It calls on Christians to take certain actions on behalf of the marginalized, just like Jesus did in his ministry or the prophets did. So no, it's not calling on Christians to remove their influence. But at the same time, I'm not making some kind of screed against the state here.
Okay.
I do believe that Romans 13 has or gives the state a legitimate role in punishing evildoers and upholding the common good. Creating the conditions that will allow for societal flourishing and whatnot. So I definitely think that there is a role for the state to play. But if you read Romans 13 in its context, starting with Romans 12, all the way through Romans 13, you'll find that the job of the state is something that is separate and distinct from the mission of the church. And while the church, the state can act legitimately to protect itself or to use the sword to maintain domestic order and stability, that's not a role that Christians can take on.
Okay.
So to give you a practical example, the United States, in my view, had every right to assassinate Osama bin Laden in 2011. This was a man who was responsible for taking the lives of thousands of innocent Americans, and the United States was right to assassinate him in Pakistan in 2011, just like Ukraine today has an absolute right to defend itself against Russian aggression. So I'm not saying that states don't have a legitimate right to bear the sword. There are people who would say that, but that's not an argument that I'm making. I'm saying that the two realms are separate, and there are certain tasks that Christians can't take on within the state.
Interesting. Yeah. I think I'm reading Hauerwas again right now. It's the community toward a social Christian, or I forget it's one he wrote way back in like 1980, like pre Resident Aliens, and I think he was, he had a good discussion about that, kind of like the different viewpoints on. Some would say no, the Christian ethic is creational; it should be applied everywhere, but the nation simply won't. Like, these kingdoms have been co-opted by Satan; they're not going to do it. So it's kind of this, like, the nations will do what the nations are going to do, versus a more positive kind of like, no, it is actually a political right and good for them to do this. I'm not sure. I'm kind of sorting through all that. The one thing I would say is I do think that, the Christian ethic, is directed towards the church. It flows from, an ecclesia, a church, a kingdom where Christ is Lord of that. I think that's where Hauerwas ends up going, right? I mean, the lordship of Jesus is not irrelevant for following an ethic. So if an entity is not naming Christ as Lord, then of course it's not going to be following a Christian ethic. I think that's probably where I lean right now, but that's a tough one. I mean, because people say, because I wrote a book on nonviolence, and like, what? So you think America should just be nonviolent? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know how to even answer that. All I know is the ethic I'm arguing for is for follower. The question is, should followers of Jesus use violence to confront evil? Like, is that part of the Romans 12 direction of the church, regardless of whether the state is allowed to, should do it, shouldn't, whatever, how we want to frame that? Like, this nonviolent ethic is directed to Christ followers, not government entities.
Exactly. And I don't even know if it's possible for the United States to act nonviolently, or any other country to act nonviolently. That's kind of just hardwired into how states behave. And, of course, states can bear the sword in unjust ways. But there's also a just bearing of the sword. And, I kind of distinguish my Christian pacifism from a more universalist kind of pacifism.
Okay.
Right. So universalist pacifists or liberal pacifists believe that violence is always wrong.
Okay.
No matter who is undertaking the violence, whether it's an individual in society or a state or even an intergovernmental organization, violence is just wrong across the board. And that isn't the view that I take in this book. My form of Christian pacifism calls on Christians to renounce violence in all of its manifestations, but also recognizes that states may have to bear the sword when necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a tough one. Even like the bin Laden, or even just America involvement in the Middle East, like from one lens, you could say, no, this is just, we're fighting against evil. But then you peek behind the curtain and like, we've created power vacuums that have been now occupied by and created almost ISIS. If I remember correctly, some of the leaders of ISIS were like trained by US military back in the 80s, back when we were using them to fight against Russia or whatever. And it's just, it gets so messy. And then you have, all the drone wars. I mean, I read the other day, hundreds of children were killed by drones under Obama's administration during that time in our quest to fight. So it's like, if you step back and look and say, has righteousness been accomplished? Like, well, even if we say the killing of bin Laden was that individual act, you look back and it's like, when you start swinging that sword around, it just perpetuates more violence, right? I mean, it doesn't seem to end the cycle of violence. But I'm getting out of my skis here. This is more your area. I'm not I've kind of peeked behind the curtain. I'm like, oh, this just raw, like blind celebration of military victories. I'm like, it's once you wield that sword, it's never a clean hit, if you know what I mean.
The problem that I see is that in the United States, at least, you have very large portions of the church that have lent their spiritual support to American wars of aggression. Yeah. And, the part that's never talked about is the terrible suffering that Christians in other countries have to endure as a result of American militarism that is supported by American Christians. Yeah. So it ends up being the situation of Christians killing Christians, and the Christians who are doing the killing don't know that they're actually killing their brothers and sisters in Christ. So in 2003, the United States launched its war against Iraq, and coming in line with the war effort were major Protestant denominations like the Southern Baptist Convention. And it would have been much more difficult for the Bush administration to have gone to war in 2003 if it didn't have the support of these domestic Christian groups, right? And so one by one, they began lining up behind the president. Now, here's the part that's never talked about. In 2003, before the US invaded Iraq, there was a fairly substantial indigenous Christian community in Iraq that was around 1.5 million people. Wow. Right? Now, these people, they didn't necessarily have the best life, but at least they were allowed to survive. And, now the Christian community in Iraq is under 100,000. Wow. And that has been a direct consequence of the Iraq War, which, as you said, led to a power vacuum, eventually the rise of ISIS, and the forcible displacement of hundreds of thousands of Christians to surrounding countries, or they were killed. Wow. And so I think, this is the side of the story that Christians in the United States and other countries, they have to understand when they get behind the war efforts of their governments. Yeah.
Man, it's I mean, now with that war, as I understand it, we look back and there really was no WMD. There's a lot of just right. I mean, is that pretty much well known that was not a good war, even though some people kind of really supported it? I think most people look back and say, I supported it when it happened, but now looking back, it's like, that was not good at all.
I think that's true for most people. There's very little good that came out of that war. Yeah. But I mean, you'll find conservative thinkers who still think that the war was justified. I have in mind David French.
Oh, really?
Who I think he's a very thoughtful person.
Yeah.
I like his work a lot, but even today he'll defend the war effort in Iraq.
Oh, interesting.
And, yeah.
So maybe he's way smarter than I am. So maybe I don't want to again speak out of turn and saying if I don't have all my facts, but all that I think we could all agree that there was a lot of innocent people that died as a result, unforeseen damage that was a result of that. Whether or not is it the cost benefit? Did the good outweigh the bad? I don't know. What are we even talking about when we say good and bad? Yeah. Well, yeah, I've already taken you way past your bedtime apparently. So Nilay, it was so good getting to know you. First of all, it was great, and maybe I pass through Singapore usually maybe once every couple of years or whatever. But next time I do, I'd love to grab a coffee with you or something.
Please do stop by. That'd be wonderful.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. Oh, again, the book is The Global Politics of Jesus by Nilay Saiya, and it is I would say it's a very readable academic book. It's you don't need to be an academic to read it. You deal with a lot of, you bring your academic background into it, but it's a very, I was so shocked because not every Oxford University Press academic book is, so lucid, but it's a very clear book. And I would recommend it to anybody that's interested in all the stuff we talked about, and especially those who are like, I disagree with half of what you guys said. I said, good, go read the book, because a lot of it is filled in and to give you some food to wrestle with. So thanks, Nilay.
If it opens up a discussion among Christians, that's what I'm hopeful for.
Yes. And as an academic, it is not a rant, or, it is a very fair treatment of alternative positions, and you've done your homework, you've digested other viewpoints, and it's presented very level-headedly. So yeah, thank you for it again.
Thanks for having me.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.